Officer Wally, a strict cop, arrested a black FBI agent, confident he was just doing his job. Later, karma hit in a way he never saw coming. What unfolded next set off a chain of events that turned his entire life upside down. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Officer Wally Steele was sitting in his police car. The low hum of the engine was making the seat shake, and his fingers were tapping impatiently on the steering wheel. Like every other night in this part of the city, the shift had been dull. There wasn't much going on or anything exciting. He was just making the rounds in an area he had given up on for good. He let out a heavy sigh and looked out at the dimly lit streets that were lined with empty shops and buildings that were falling apart. He has never wanted to be here. This was the kind of place that made him angry, run down, and full of people who didn't want to make their lives better and always blamed others for their troubles. He looked at the clock on his dashboard and felt his breath hiss through his teeth. He still had 3 hours of work to go, and there was nothing to break up the boredom. He saw a figure as he drove by a corner store that was closed. Outside the door, a black woman stood hunched over and held a cane in one hand and a plastic shopping bag in the other. She was wearing a coat that was too big for her and a hat with a wide top that blocked the sun from her face. Wally thought she didn't belong there. She was too old to be out this late, and strange to be standing there for no reason. He made his eyes narrow. Why does she have to be out here at this time? He felt uneasy around her in some way. Wally had learned a long time ago to spot trouble, or at least what he thought was trouble, and this woman fit the bill. Waiting around, they're probably homeless, or even worse, they might be doing something illegal. Even though she looked weak, that didn't bother him, because he knew that looks could be false. His eyes were fixed on her as he stopped the police car across the street and watched her move slowly and carefully. She was just standing there and moving her weight from one leg to the other every so often, but that was enough. Wally didn't think she had to be doing anything to make him suspicious. The fact that she was in this neighborhood in the middle of the night was enough. Wally let out a breath through his nose and squished his hands on the steering wheel even more. His heart beat faster, not because he was scared, but because he was excited to show who was in charge. He liked these times because they made him feel strong, like he could command respect, or at least make people respect him. This woman was about to be told where she was, and who was in charge, even though it looked like she had all the time in the world. He put the car in park and opened the door. The sound of his boots hitting the ground broke up the silence of the night. As he crossed the street, he saw that the woman didn't even move. When he got close, she wasn't tense or moving around like most people do when they see a police officer coming toward them. It made him mad. "Hey, Wally!" yelled, and his voice broke the silence. The woman slowly turned her head, and you could just barely see her eyes through the brim of her hat. She didn't say anything or move, which made him even more angry. They were only a few steps apart when he closed the gap and stopped a few feet in front of her. She looked even older than he thought she was when he got closer. Her skin was rough, and her hands were thin and bony. Her clothes were used, and they were in bad shape, which made him think she didn't have much. "Ask yourself, why are you here? Do what I say," Wally demanded, his words firm and sharp. He was expecting an answer right away, but all the woman did was blink at him. She looked calm, almost serene. Wally was scared because she didn't seem scared. He stepped closer and straightened up as he tried to make himself more noticeable to her. "I asked you a question. Do you have ID?" He felt uneasy as the woman looked at him with her eyes in a way that made him stay quiet for a moment. She finally spoke, and her voice was soft but firm. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just about to go home." Wally laughed and curled his lips into a sneer. "Home? It's past midnight. You shouldn't just hang out here like this. What's in the bag?" The woman looked down at the plastic bag she had in her hand. She lifted the bag a little to make it look like there was nothing strange inside, and said, just some groceries. Wally didn't care. The way she stayed calm and wouldn't let anything bother her was bothering him. Through his job, he had dealt with many different types of people. Most of them knew better than to fight with the police officer, especially in this part of town. But this woman wasn't following the rules. The fact that she wasn't scared made him want to do more. "Show me what's inside," he said, his voice getting lower and scarier. It looked like the woman was tired as she sighed, but she didn't say anything. She slowly opened the bag and showed him some normal things inside. A piece of bread, a carton of milk, and some canned goods. Wally wasn't happy, though. He was hoping for more drugs, stolen goods, anything that would make him feel better about his suspicions. Not finding anything made him even more angry. "Is that all you have on you?" he asked, his voice filled with shock. It felt like a few people were watching him from the shadows. So he looked around the street to make sure no one else was there. The woman just nodded and didn't say anything else. Wally felt like he was losing control of the situation, which made him very angry. He had to show who was boss and tell herself and her that he was in charge. His mind was racing as he looked for anything that could make things worse. "Show me your ID," he said again, but this time with more force. The woman didn't change how she looked. She reached into her coat slowly, being careful and thoughtful about her steps. He took her ID out of an old wallet, and she didn't say a word. Wally grabbed it from her and quickly looked at the name and address. Mary Hill, a normal-looking address in the area. He didn't care about that though. He could feel himself losing control, which hurt his pride. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he gave her the ID back. His eyes got narrow. "Really? Why are you out here?" he asked, as he leaned in closer, and his voice almost turned into a growl. "Your story doesn't make sense to me. What is your real reason for being in this neighborhood at this time?" Mary didn't blink as she looked him straight in the eye. "Officer, I told you the truth. I just want to get home. You don't have to treat me like a thief." It was too much to take in, her calm voice and steady look. Wally's face turned red with anger. She couldn't act like she wasn't scared of him, did she? How dare she question his authority? She was being nice and quiet, but he wasn't going to let her get away with it. He spat at her and stepped closer until they were almost face to face. "Lady, you don't tell me what I need to do," he said. "I will make sure you understand that you are in the wrong place at the wrong time." It was very tense now, and the street was dead quiet, which made what they were saying even stronger. Wally's heart was beating fast and excitement was pumping through his body. It was unclear to him why this woman, who looked old and fragile, had become so important to him. He only knew he had to get back in charge. He was determined to show his power before the situation got out of hand. And he wasn't going to stop until it did. Officer Wally Steele stood tall over Mary, and the air felt thicker around him. His chest rose and fell in short, angry breaths. In front of his authority, he couldn't understand how this old woman, who looked so small and weak, could stay so calm. People in this area were used to getting scared when they saw him in uniform. But she wasn't like the others, which scared him. It was very quiet on the street around them, with only the odd distant sound of a car engine or a conversation that was hard to make out. Some people on foot sped up when they saw the fight, because they didn't want to get stuck in the middle of whatever was going to happen. Long, wavy shadows were cast over the cracked ground by the yellow light from the street lamps. This made the scene feel unsettling, like it was in a bad dream. Wally was boiling over. He felt bad about himself every second that Mary stood there, calm and steady. He could tell that his patience was running out and that he was losing control like water. His hands twitched at his sides, and his fingers were itching to do something that would make her act the way he wanted her to, scared, loyal, and submissive. But she did nothing. She stood there with one hand on her cane, and her eyes fixed on him in a way that he couldn't read. It wasn't so much defiance as it was certainty. It wasn't fear either, that made things worse. Even though he was in charge, She was sure of herself, which was a problem. "You're not from around here, right?" Wally spat and took another step toward her, putting his face just inches away from hers. He had been drinking coffee all night to stay awake, so his breath was hot. Mary did not move. She answered, "I've lived in this neighborhood longer than you've been an officer." Her voice was soft but firm. "Hey, I know these streets better than most people." Wally clenched his teeth. He didn't want that answer. He wanted her to trip up, to show that she was scared of him and knew how strong he was. She didn't, though. The way she talked made it sound like she had nothing to worry about and was in charge, which was not okay. He growled, "Then you should know better than to stand here in the middle of the night. You know what goes on around here, right? It's not safe for you." Mary kept her eyes on him. "Officer, I've seen worse things than you can think of. It's not one of them to stand outside of a closed store." Wally didn't fully understand why her words hurt so much. It could have been the way she said them, humble and calm, like she had nothing to prove. It made his blood boil even more. He moved forward one more time, getting so close that their shoes almost touched. He could see the fine lines on her face and the silver hair sticking out from under her wide-brimmed hat. That made him very angry, because she looked tired, but not weak. He said, in a low voice that was barely held back rage, "Let me tell you something, lady. That's not how you talk to me. You can't stand here and act like the rules don't apply to you. You have no right to treat me badly." Mary slightly tilted her head and made a thoughtful face with her lips together. She really looked at him as if she were trying to figure out who he was, to get past his anger and find something more important. Wally felt even worse when she didn't say anything. It was like she could see right through him, past the uniform and badge, to something he didn't want to admit. "Officer, I'm not being rude," she said quietly, after a long pause. "I'm not scared of you at all." That was it. Wally's anger made it hard for him to see, and he clenched his jaw so hard that it hurt. Why did she do that? That old woman has no right to say that to him, who is a police officer. It wasn't just an insult to him. It was an insult to everything he stood for. He was in charge, not she. She was meant to respect and fear him. That's how things went. He hissed, his voice barely above a whisper, "You should be." He made a silent warning, with his hand moving near his belt, where his flashlight was hanging. "Be careful, you don't want to hurt anyone." Mary's eyes quickly dropped when she saw his hand move, but she didn't move away. She didn't even move. She said in a soft voice, "You don't know who you're talking to, Officer Steele." Something about the way she said his name, his full name, made Wally feel uneasy. How did she know what his name was? He had not said his name. The thought hit him like a slap in the face, but he pushed it away right away. He thought that she might have been able to see his name tag. That was all. She had no idea what he was like. But that short moment of doubt, that small seed of fear, took root in the back of his mind and kept bothering him as he tried to stay calm. He wouldn't let her see it or win. "Do you not believe you are smart?" He spat, and the poison in his words was hard to miss. "You act like you're better than me and talk to me like that?" The tone of Mary's voice stayed cool and steady as she said, "I never said that. I just want to get home." Wally yelled and stepped closer until there wasn't much room between them. "You're not telling the truth. I know it. It's clear in your eyes." Mary kept her eyes on him. "What do you see when you look into my eyes?" When Officer Wally tried to answer, he opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time in the meeting, he didn't know what to do. What did her eyes show him? He had no idea. He only knew that she wasn't acting like she should have. She wasn't scared, which threw him off. He felt small and helpless, like his outfit and badge didn't matter. That felt like the most dangerous thing in the world right now. His voice was shaking a little, showing that he was angry just below the surface. He said, "Listen, after treating me badly like that, you can't just leave this. I will make sure you learn your place." Mary kept quiet and kept her eyes on him, carefully watching him. She wasn't directly challenging him, but the fact that she was calm and wouldn't bow down to his power was a challenge in and of itself, and Wally didn't know how to deal with it. "Why do you must do this? I demand," he said, getting more angry as he spoke. "Why do you act like no one can touch you? You're not. No one would mind if I arrested you right now." Mary said, in a quiet voice, "You could, but would that make you feel better, Officer Steele?" He was shocked by the question. He tightened his fists at his sides, and his knuckles turned white as he fought the urge to hit her. How did she manage to stay so calm? Even though he was getting more and more angry, he still asked him that question. Wally's chest hurt, and his heart was beating fast. The seconds seemed to last for hours. He really wanted to do something to make her lose her cool and act the way he thought she would. But nothing he said or did seemed to sway her, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. He said it again, this time with a shaking voice. "You're not going to leave this," he said. "I'll make sure of that," but he could feel the words leaving him empty. His job was new to him, and he didn't know what would happen next. He wasn't sure if he was in charge of the situation. For the first time, he was totally off balance because Mary was so quiet and calm, and he didn't know how to get back on track. They were tense with each other. It was thick and smothering. The street was still, but Wally felt like a heavy stone was pressing down on his chest. From their argument, he could feel the energy pumping through his body, getting it ready for anything to happen. But it didn't. Mary stood still, her eyes fixed on his, and her face was blank. Wally felt uncertainty at that very moment, which was something he hadn't felt in a long time. He began to doubt himself for the first time. He had doubts about his actions, his roles in the situation, and his reasons for them. That doubt was the scariest thing about it all. Wally Steele's breath was now coming in short, rough bursts. There was an unsaid tension in the air between him and Mary Hill. His mind was racing with different thoughts and feelings. He wasn't used to this. People who were like her, people who should be easy to break and control, were the first ones to stand up to him. Something inside him snapped in an instant. He really didn't like how helpless he felt being looked down at by a woman who was half his size and more than twice his age. It was up to him to show her and make her understand that she could not get away from his rule or win this game of silent resistance. He reached out and grabbed Mary's thin arm without thinking, pulling her forward with more force than was needed. Then her body jerked toward him. For a split second, he saw pain flash across her face, but she didn't say a word. She shook while holding the groceries, but she didn't drop them. Her cane shook, and she had to shift her weight to keep from falling. This threw off her balance for a moment. "Do you really think you can just stand here and talk to me like that?" Wally hissed at her with his low, mean voice and his face close to hers. He tightened his hold on her arm and dug his fingers into her skin. "Do you think I'll let you go after you treated me badly?" She didn't say anything. His hand was on her arm, and she looked down at it. Then she looked back up to meet his gaze, clear and steady as ever. The way she didn't cower or respond with that look made him even more angry. He thought she would scream, say sorry, and beg him to let go, but she didn't do any of those things. She said, in a soft but strong voice, "Let go of me." Wally's grip got even tighter. His fingers felt the weak bones of her body. A voice in the back of his mind told him to stop and back off before things got worse. But the noise of his anger quickly shut it out. How could she be so calm? He spat at her and pulled her closer. "You have no right to tell me what to do. You're the one acting like this is yours. What do you know? You don't." "Yes." Mary blinked, but the calm in her eyes was still there. "Officer Steele, is this really about me or about you?" The pain of her words was worse than any blow to the body. Anger shot through his body, and he could hear his heart beating in his ears. She shouldn't have said that to him. She was acting like she knew him or what he was going through when she tried to psychoanalyze him. "Shut up," he growled, his voice shaking with anger that was hard to hold back. "You don't know anything about me." It was painfully quiet when she replied. It was like she didn't need to say anything else. Just the way she looked at him was enough to show her the weakness she saw in him, the doubt that lay beneath his rage. She wasn't scared of him. He was scared because she wasn't scared of his badge, his power, or his threats. He said, "I'm not going to ask you again," his voice getting a little louder as the weight of his doubt hit it. "Either you work with me, or things will get much worse for you." She didn't move, though. It wasn't like she pulled away, fought, or was angry. Instead, she looked at him with those same steady, calm eyes and told him, "Officer Steele, you lost control as soon as you touched me." The things she said hurt him very much. As his mind tried to process what she said, his body responded before he could fully understand it. He raised his free hand and punched, before he could stop himself. It happened very quickly. His hand hit the side of her face with great force. The blow was stronger than he meant, and Mary fell backwards from the force of it. Her cane hit the ground, and as she tried to balance herself, her body twisted in an awkward way. When she opened her shopping bag, cans and a loaf of bread fell out and rolled across the sidewalk. Wally stood there still for a moment, his fist still clenched, and his breath coming out in rough, uneven gasps. He could still hear the sound of the punch in the street, and it went through his head. He felt his heart racing in his chest and his ears pounding as the truth of what he had done hit him like a cold blanket. Mary tripped and fell to one knee. She slowly got back on her feet by pressing her hand against the ground. She didn't scream or cry out. She just used the back of her hand to wipe a small amount of blood from the corner of her mouth and stood up, shaky but determined. Wally felt sickly happy for a moment because he knew he had finally broken her and shown her who was boss. But that feeling went away almost as quickly as it came back when Mary turned back to face him. Even though her eyes were still steady and calm, there was something else in them that made Wally feel sick to his stomach over and over again. It wasn't fear, it wasn't hurt. Sadness filled the room. In a soft voice that was hard to miss, she said, "You're going to regret that." Wally got a chill up his spine. He wasn't sure what was making him feel uneasy about the way she said those words, yet, but it did. He opened his mouth to answer, to say something, to take back control, but nothing came out. His tongue was heavy and his throat was sore. Mary quickly reached into the pocket of her coat. The move was slow and calculated, and Wally's gut told him what to do. As he watched her, he reached for his gun and curled his fingers around the handle. She had been hiding a weapon the whole time, waiting for the right time to attack. For a scary moment, he thought she might be pulling it out. She didn't pull a gun out of her pocket, though. It was a lot worse. She held out a small black leather wallet slowly and opened it with a smooth move. Inside was a shiny FBI badge. The gold and silver colors made it stand out against the dim light from the street lamp above. As Wally looked in shock at the badge, his eyes got bigger and his breath got caught in his throat. What he was seeing was too much for his mind to handle. His chest hurt, and each beat was louder than the last. He tried to put words together and say something, but his voice wouldn't work. "My name is Special Agent Mary Hill," she said in a soft voice. A tone of quiet power that scared people more than any threat or shout. "I'm hiding, Officer Steele. You just did something very, very wrong." Wally felt like the world was tilting around him, and a sickening wave of fear was washing over him. His hand fell off the gun and hung limp at his side. As he looked at the badge and at the woman he had just beaten up. She was an undercover FBI agent. It hit him like a huge wave, that what he had done was real. His mind was racing, trying to find a way out. An explanation or a reason that would fix what had happened, but there was none. The punch could not be taken back, and the fact that he had just hit a government agent outside in public could not be erased. Everything he had worked for in his job was falling apart right in front of his eyes. She moved toward him and never took her eyes off of him. "Help is on the way," she said quietly, and her tone was almost sympathetic. "Officer Steele, you'll have to answer for what you did." Wally's stomach was in knots, and his knees felt like they were going to give out. His brain told him to run, to get away before it was too late. But the weight of what he had done had frozen his body in place. He did something wrong and could never take it back. His thoughts were clouded by Mary's calm voice. It was the last statement that would prove him guilty. "Your job is done." Wally could hear the faint sound of sirens coming from a distance. The sound got louder with each second that went by. As he looked at the woman in front of him, no longer an old stranger's heart raced and his hands shook. She was an FBI agent and held his fate in her hands. He could not stop it. Wally Steele stood still and stared at Mary Hill's FBI badge as if it were a snake ready to strike. His mind was racing as he tried to make sense of what had just happened and find a link between the weak old woman he had hit and the tough federal agent who stood in front of him. As the truth of what he had done sank in like a heavy weight, he felt a strange buzzing in his ears and a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. He hit a secret FBI agent with a punch. Wally could just barely make out the sirens that were getting louder in the background. The sound of his heart beating loudly in his chest drowned out the sounds of the city. He didn't know what to do with his hand, so it hung near his belt. Should he get his radio and call for help? No, that didn't help. There was help on the way, but it wasn't for him. Tonight, he wasn't the one being saved. Mary stood still, her body relaxed but strong, and her face still had a small bruise from his punch. Now that she was past the pain, it was impossible to read. What was left was something much scarier. Wally could see that. She wasn't mad. She wasn't yelling or making threats. She wasn't doing anything. She was just waiting, as if she knew what was going to happen next, and was just watching it happen. Wally said, in a weak, hoarse voice, "You don't understand. You don't. It was not meant to happen this way." Mary didn't answer right away. She didn't move, and the weight of her look hit him like an invisible force. She finally spoke, and her voice was just as calm and steady as always. "Officer Steele, you made it happen. You picked what to do." Wally clenched his teeth. The street was too quiet to stand, except for the sound of sirens coming up behind him. The sounds that used to calm him down, like the wail of a police car, and the sight of bright lights, now made him feel scared. He thought his knees were going to give out at any time. Wally began to speak, but his voice cracked as he tried to explain himself. "I had no idea who you were. You are hiding." It was Mary who cut through his excuses with the cold voice. "I'm an FBI agent, and you assaulted me. Now, it doesn't matter what else." Wally stared at her with the confused and angry look on his face. He wasn't sure what to do. He felt like he was in a nightmare and couldn't wake up from this moment. How did he get here? He was the police officer. The person in charge was meant to be him. It was his street, his rules, and his job. Still, everything changed in an instant. Mary moved forward, but her eyes were still on him. "Do you really believe you're above the law?" Almost in a whisper, she spoke. "It's been a long time since you did that, right? Being mean to people you believe can't fight back." Wally felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to scream and fight back against what she was saying. But what she was saying was too much for him to handle. She knew. She could see right through him. She knew who he was and what he had been doing very well. Wally started to say, "I was just," but he couldn't finish the thought. What exactly? Just following the law? Just doing his job? Even he didn't believe the reasons. He was running through his thoughts, trying to think of something, anything, that could save the situation. It was Mary's words that cut through his thoughts again. She said, "I've been keeping an eye on your department for a while." Her voice was cool, but there was a seriousness to it that Wally couldn't ignore. "You're not the only one. This misuse of power and greed goes deep, and you're a part of it." Wally's heart jumped a beat, and his eyes got bigger. He had always been aware that his station was being looked into. Some people had heard that the federal government was looking into things, and that strangers were looking around, but no one ever thought it would get this bad. Not a single person thought that a secret operation would go after someone like him. In his mind, he wasn't a thief. It was just his job as a police officer. Wally tried to say, "Didn't again," but Mary stopped him. She told him straight out, "You didn't mean to get caught. You thought no one would ever judge you, but you were wrong. That was very wrong." Her words hit Wally like rocks and sank him into a pit of fear and panic. It made him want to fight back and argue, but what could he say? He hit her. He had done something wrong that couldn't be fixed. Finally, she was there, with all the power in her hand. She moved forward one more step, and now her face was only a few inches away from his. Wally could see that her cheek was bruised and that there was a little swelling where his hand had hit her. He tried to push down his guilt, but it kept biting him. He said it again, but this time, his voice was weak and shaking. "This wasn't supposed to happen." "But it did," Mary said, and her tone didn't show any pity. "And now, you'll have to deal with the results." Now, the sirens were so loud that Wally had to turn his head a little to see the flashing lights coming around the bend. There was a black SUV and 2 police cars pulling up. The tires screeched as they stopped quickly. The doors of the SUV opened, and several guys in suits got out. Then, uniformed officers got out of the squad cars. When Wally saw the FBI agent walk out, he felt his breath catch in his throat. The agent's face was serious and stern. Mary didn't do anything. She did not move at all while she waited for the others to come. She still held her badge. Wally's stomach dropped when one of the agents, a tall guy with a serious face and a stern voice, walked up to Mary. With a short nod, he showed her love. "Agent Hill," the man said, in a polite but hurried voice. "Are you okay?" Mary gave a single nod. It was a quiet, "I'm fine. I have everything I need." "That was more than enough proof," Wally said. His mind was a mess. More than enough proof? What did she mean? He quickly looked back at Mary. And that's when he saw something small and barely noticeable tucked into the collar of her coat. There was a tiny camera in the cloth that was about the size of a button. He had trouble breathing. They had been filming the whole thing. His attack, his threats, it was all caught on video. He felt like the ground was giving way under him. Piece by piece, his job, his life, and everything else was falling apart. "You," Wally mumbled, "you set me up." The truth hit him like a freight train. At first, Mary didn't say anything. She just stared at him with that cool, unblinking look that had scared him from the start. She finally spoke, and her voice was cold and steady. "Officer Steele, I didn't have to set you up. When you chose to abuse your power, you set yourself up for failure. I just gave you a chance to show what you're really like." Wally got a cold sweat on the top of his head. In his temples, he could feel his heart beating fast, and his hands were shaking violently. Being a police officer, he always believed that no one could hurt him because of his badge. But now, in just a few minutes, everything had fallen apart around him. Now, the other spies were moving in and surrounding him. He could hear them talking, but it sounded like they were speaking from underwater, because their voices were far away and muffled. He pulled his arm behind his back as one of the agents reached out and grabbed it. Wally couldn't fight back, so he didn't. He had made too many mistakes, and his mind was too dull to feel anything. Wally Steele felt what it was like to be on the wrong side of the law for the first time. When the cold metal handcuffs snapped around his wrists, he saw the irony. As a police officer, he had handcuffed a lot of people, but he never thought that one day he would be the one standing there helpless as the police closed in on him. Wally looked back at Mary as they led him to the waiting car. She was still standing where she had been the whole time, and her face didn't change. While she looked at him, she kept her cool, as if it were just another day at work for her. It could have been. Mary spoke again just before they pushed him into the back of the police car. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but Wally could understand every word. She told Officer Steele, "This isn't just about you. This is about your whole work system and department. We're going to tear it all down." Wally's heart sank. He thought the worst was over, and that things could not get any worse. But as soon as the door shut behind him and the agents moved to question Mary, he knew the worst was yet to come. Once the car drove off, the sirens faded into the background. Mary was left standing alone on the quiet street, listening to the sounds of the city slowly getting back to normal. There was nothing normal about this moment, though. It was the start of something much bigger that would have effects for beyond this one meeting. It was the end of everything Wally Steele had ever known. Wally Steele was sitting in the back of the police car with his hands cuffed. He was very confused, scared, and couldn't believe what he was seeing. The air inside the car was thick with the smell of old leather and sweat, and his thoughts were making it even worse. He kept going over the last hour in his mind: the argument, the punch, the badge, and the realization that Mary Hill wasn't just an old lady. She was an undercover FBI agent. He kept being hit with the truth of what he had done, and each time it hurt more. He had attacked a federal agent, and the attack was caught on tape. Everything he thought was stable in his life and work was falling apart right in front of his eyes. He worked hard for years to show that he was a tough, no-nonsense police officer. He had learned to rule with an iron hand because he thought that his badge gave him the power to control, dominate, and bring order to the world as he saw fit. But now it was all falling apart, and Wally didn't know what to do. For the first time, Wally was thinking when the squad car hit a bump and jolted. When he looked out the window, he felt his heart sink as they drove by familiar streets, and the city rushed by in a blur of lights and shadows. It had always felt like these streets were his, and that he was in charge. Now, though, they seemed strange and far away, like he was seeing them from the wrong side of the law. Right there, on the wrong side, was where he was now. He felt sick to his stomach as he thought about what was coming. After cops crossed the line and were caught in scandals, he knew what would happen to them. Some people were lucky enough to only get slapped on the wrist, but others lost everything. He hadn't broken the rules or skimmed off the top, so this wasn't a small incident. A video showed that he hit an FBI worker. He felt sick to his stomach at the thought. How did it get this far? The car slowly stopped outside the station. Its flashing red and blue lights bounced off the building walls and lit up the lot in a scary way. Wally's heart rate went up. This wasn't the right way for him to get back to the station. He had walked into this building hundreds or even thousands of times, with his head held high, acting like a police officer. Now, though, the roles were switched. He was no longer walking in as a police officer. He was walking in as a thief. Another cop, a younger man that Wally didn't know, motioned for Wally to get out of the car when the back door opened. Wally thought about what he was about to do for a second. Happen and press down on him, making it hard for him to move. But the police officer had a strong grip on his arm as he led him out of the car. Realizing what was going on hit Wally like a freight train. As soon as he stood up, his handcuffs slapped against each other as he was led to the front door of the station. The cold metal bit into his skin, even though he had been through that entry a million times. Something about it felt horribly different this time. The steps they took to get to the front desk felt heavy than the last. People in the station turned their heads when they saw who was being brought in. There were murmurs all over the room, and people were whispering Wally's name and wondering what they were seeing. He could feel their eyes on him. They were officers he had worked with for years, officers he had laughed and shared drinks with, and officers who used to look up to him. "What the hell is going on?" someone muttered, their voice full of shock and confusion. "He's in handcuffs," said a voice that was hard to make out over the noise of the talk. They walked through the front area, past the officers who were looking at them, and toward the holding area. The younger officer leading him didn't say a word. Wally's legs hurt like lead, and every step was a painful reminder of what was going on. He didn't look up and wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. He didn't have to look to understand what they were think. Everyone had the same thought. How did this happen? When they got to the desk where people do work, Wally was pushed into a chair in front of a thick glass wall. The officer who was leading him left, and a processing officer took his place. This officer looked like he was more used to dealing with tough crooks than with other police officers. He sat down next to Wally with the clipboard in his hand, and looked at him for a moment, as if he was trying to figure out what he was seeing. "Name? What's going on?" the officer finally asked, his voice flat and professional, like this was just another booking. Wally forced a hard swallow. His mouth was dry, just barely able to get the words out. He said, "Wally Steele." The police officer wrote something on his clipboard. "Steele, you know the drill. There will be charges, but the main one is assaulting a government agent." Wally's throat got tight. What was he going to say to protest and defend himself? There was no way to hide what had happened. He did what the police officer told him to do, and now he had to face the results. "You'll be kept in the cells until they decide what to do with you," the processing officer said, barely taking his eyes off his clipboard. "You're going to be taken into federal custody soon, but for now, you're our guest." Wally thought it was very funny that the word guest was used, because he wasn't a guest, he was a prisoner. And every second that went by, that fact became more and more real. After having his fingerprints and picture taken, Wally was led to the holding cells down a short hallway. There was a strong smell of disinfectant in the air, along with sweat and old smokes. He had been with suspects down this hallway many times before, but now, it felt like the walls were closing in on him with every step. Wally jerked back as the officer leading him opened a cell door. The loud metal clang echoed off the walls and scared him. It was rude to push him inside. When the door swung open, when the door slammed shut behind him, he felt a heavy wave of fear wash over him. His ears were filled with the sound of the lock clicking into place. Wally Steele was locked in a cell for the first time in his life. He stood there for a moment, letting the truth of his situation sink in. The cell was very small. The steel sink in the corner and the narrow cot, pushed up against the far wall, made it just fit. The toilet was out in the open, so there was no privacy. The walls were dirty and had writing scratched into them. It was over. This was his new life. Wally sat down on the cot and put his head in his hands. He could still feel the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. It was hard for him to calm down. He was trying to think of a way out, a reason, or something that would save him. There was nothing, though. He had already made his decisions, so he couldn't get away from the results. The hours went by slowly. The only sounds that broke the silence in the cell were the odd footsteps of police officers, or the murmur of voices far away. Wally's emotions went up and down, going from anger and fear to shock and sorrow. He wanted to blame someone else, not himself. Mary, the FBI, anyone but himself. But he knew in his heart that this was his fault. His anger got the best of him, and now he had to pay for it. It seemed like forever before he heard the sound of footsteps coming toward his cell. When Wally looked up, he saw a face he knew, Lieutenant Greg Hainan, who was his direct boss. Hainan stood outside the bars with his arms crossed over his chest and a sad face. At first, he didn't say anything. Instead, he just stared at Wally with a look that Wally couldn't quite put his finger on. "What the hell happened, Steele?" Hainan finally asked, his voice low and angry. "What did you do?" Wally opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. What could he say about it? How could he get Hainan to understand what had happened? How was he going to explain how quickly things had gotten out of hand? Wally began to say, "I didn't," but the words didn't feel real. He had no way to defend himself. "It happened right now, Lieutenant." Hainan's eyes got darker. "I didn't know what." That she worked for the FBI, or didn't know you were again breaking the law? Wally had a bad feeling in his gut. Hanan's words hung in the air between them, making it hard to breathe. I didn't mean for this to happen, Wally said, in a voice that was almost a whisper. Hanan shook his head, and his face turned serious. That's no longer important, Steele. The things you did are what count, and you will have to deal with the results. Wally could feel the last bits of hope leaving him. Hanan was right, we couldn't get out of this. There were no reasons or excuses that could change what had happened. Wally said in a whisper, I'm sorry, but the words didn't mean anything to him. Hanan stared at him for a long time, but it was impossible to read his face. He didn't say anything else, just turned around and left. Wally was left alone in the cell with his guilt and sorrow. The hall was filled with the sound of Hanan's cell block door closing behind him. Wally sank back onto the cot and put his head in his hands. Mary Hill sat across from the rest of her team in a quiet room with no windows. The harsh neon lights above gave the space a clean, sterile glow. This wasn't a normal FBI office. It was only there for a short time, as part of a secret operation in the middle of the city. There were corkboards on the walls, and each one was full of photos, papers, and maps that showed months of investigation work. The long table in the middle of the room was full of files that were all over the place. As agents looked through them, the contents of the files fell out in jumbled piles. As Mary leaned back in her chair, she could feel the events of the night pressing down on her. It wasn't the pain of Wally Steele's punch, even though her cheek was still sore and swollen. It was finally time for the mental toll of the mission to end. When I finally faced Steele, after weeks of working undercover and many long, frustrating days of gathering proof, it felt like both a victory and a wake-up call. Special Agent in charge Daniel Harris, who was sitting across from her, was reading through the most recent reports. He was tall, had a serious face, and sharp eyes. He was always doing math and planning ahead. Harris had worked for the Bureau for many years, and every choice he made was based on his knowledge. His leadership gave his team faith even when things were tough, because he was steady like a rock. He looked up at Mary, but she couldn't read his face. She could tell he was worried because of the look in his eyes. Hill, are you okay? What is it? He asked, in a strong but low voice. Mary said, yes, but the dull pain in her cheek made her think of what had happened. I'm fine. There's nothing new for me to deal with. Harris took a quick look at her and then leaned back in his chair. That punch Steele threw was really strong. You did a good job with it. She said, I had to, and her voice was calm but tired. I did what I needed to do so we could get what we needed. For a moment, the room was silent, as the weight of her words hung in the air. Officer Steele and Mary were really tense, almost raw, but it was good that they were. Because she knew Steele was a dangerous person, she knew it would only take the right push to set him off. He tapped a pen against the table edge and said, You were right about him from the start. We knew that area had problems, but Steele is even worse than we thought. Mary sighed because the research was putting a lot of stress on her. For weeks, she had been living in Steele's ward and working as a retired old woman who had moved into the neighborhood. She had quietly watched for hours on end, taking note of how police officers interacted with people in the community, how people of color were treated differently than white residents, and how officers like Steele abused their power in both obvious and not so obvious ways. I saw it right away, Mary said, her voice calm but tense with anger. Steele wasn't just a cop doing what he was told. He was eagerly looking for reasons to show his strength and use force. He enjoyed it. The other four spies on the team, who had been working with her in different roles, nodded in agreement. Each of them had seen the signs, police officers like Steele, who were so set in their ways that they thought no one could get close to them. It wasn't just one bad cop. The people in charge had let this attitude grow for years without doing anything about it. His voice broke the quiet as he said, We have everything we need now. The audio recordings and video clips from your body cam are more than enough to prove this case. What Steele did tonight sealed his fate. Mary said, yes, but her thoughts were already off of Steele. He was only a part of the story. Even though what he did was terrible, it was a sign of a bigger problem. More than one cop in that precinct had let Steele get away. With his behavior, or even worse, they had encouraged it. It's not just Steele, Mary said, her voice getting stern. That line of work has more going on. There is a lot of corruption, and I don't think we've found it all yet. Harris nodded, but his brow was wrinkled with thought. We are keeping an eye on a few more officers. Steele may stand out the most, but we know he wasn't acting by himself. This goes up further. Lieutenant Hanlon has been on our watch for a while. This is all traced back to him. When the name Hanlon came up, Mary got very angry. While she was hiding, she kept a close eye on him. He was very careful, even more so than Steele, but it was clear that he was involved. He had made it possible for officers like Steele to do well. And it was not only okay to abuse power, it was even promoted. Mary said, with anger in her voice, Hanlon's been filling in for Steele for years. Either every complaint against Steele was buried or thrown out. We haven't been able to prove it yet, but I'm sure Hanlon has also been taking payments. Harris hit the pen against the table again, and it was clear that he was planning out the next steps. We'll have to plan ahead. If we give away too much too soon, Hanlon and the others might get scared. But now that Steele is in our hands, things are really tough. They know we're going to get them. Mary took a quick look at the papers that were lying out on the table. Each one was an example of police misconduct. The people whose lives had been changed by cops like Steele were hurt by a system that did not protect them. All of the files talked about unfair treatment of people who were thought to be thieves because of their race or the area where they lived. And each one made her feel bad about herself. We need to do this right, she said, but this time her voice was softer. They can't come back after we take them down, he said. Don't hit people on the wrist anymore. There will be no more deals. A steady look from Harris came her way. That's the plan. It will take time, though. We'll flip Steele now that we have him. He will give us what we need to beat Hanlon and the others once he knows what's at stake. Mary wasn't sure about it. Women like Steele had been seen before. They were sure they were unbeatable and would hold on to their power even as it was taken away. It wouldn't be easy to flip him, and she didn't think he'd give up his coworkers without a fight. He was right about one thing, though. They had the upper hand now. With the proof they had gathered, Steele could not get away. He was in jail, just had to be smart about how they played their cards. As the group kept talking about what to do next, Mary's mind went back to the fight she had with Steele. She knew it would be tense, but she didn't think he would lose it so quickly. It made him think of how scary men like him could be when their power was at risk. She rubbed her face without meaning to, and the bruise was still sore to the touch. Even though she took the punch and stayed standing, it wasn't the blow that stuck with her. It made them realize how much Steele hated someone, and how easily he had turned to violence when that person wouldn't do what he said. Mary? Harris's voice woke her up. When she looked up, he was looking at her with a worried face. Are you okay? He asked it again, but this time it was softer. Mary said yes, but she could feel everything pushing down on her. She said, yeah, I'm fine. But the words didn't mean much. I don't want to think about how much work we still have to do. Harris gave her a small nod to show that he got it. He said, we'll get them. It will take some time, but we'll get them all. Mary was willing to believe him. For the people who had been hurt and the families who had been torn apart by the abuse of cops like Steele and the broken system that protected them, she had to believe him. She had to think they were going to win. But she knew in her heart that the fight would go on even after Steele and Hanlon were killed. There would always be more police officers like them and more departments like this one. The fight for real justice was still going strong. After the meeting was over, Mary put her things away and put the files in her bag. As the rest of the team left, she stayed behind for a moment and stared at the board that was full of faces of victims, police officers, and witnesses. Each one added to the bigger story of a system that had been left to break down from the inside out. Taking a deep breath, she turned to leave, her mind already on the next part of the plan. Even though Steele was in jail, the real work had just begun. Wally Steele was in a small, empty cell by himself. He had his back against the cold cell wall. There was a steady buzzing sound of fluorescent lights above, giving the room an unhealthy amount of dim light. There was no window, clock, or other way to tell time in the cell. All that could be heard was the constant ticking of his thoughts, which got louder as the seconds went by. The air had a faint smell of bleach and sweat, and the smell stuck to his rumpled and stained clothing. It felt like the handcuffs were still on his wrists, even though they had been taken off hours before. His thoughts were all over the place, going back and forth between anger, fear, and doubt. He kept thinking about the exact moment he hit Mary Hilth. Split second his fist hit her face, making a terrible crunch. He told himself over and over that he was in charge and had the power in that situation. That being said, things really got out of hand as soon as he touched her. Why did I let it get this bad? He couldn't get rid of the thought. He did something that he could never take back. It was the end of his job, his reputation, and his life as he knew it. Mary Hill is an FBI agent who was attacked by him. She was someone who had been watching him and set him up. The way she played him was perfect. She kept luring him into her trap until he finally broke. Finally, he was in jail, waiting for his fate to be decided by people he used to work with and who, just hours before, would have stood by him no matter what. They were the ones who locked him up. Now, there was a creak as the door to the holding area opened, and footsteps could be heard down the hall. Wally shook his head and felt his heart beat fast in his chest. He thought he would see a familiar face, like Lieutenant Hainan or a cop from his precinct, who was there to reassure him. When the person was seen, though, it wasn't a police officer. It was Mary Hill. Two federal officers in dark suits stood on either side of her at the door to his cell. His fist had hit her in the face, leaving a dark purple mark that bloomed across her cheek. She stood straight and didn't bend at all. There was no anger or sadness in her eyes, only cold, professional determination. Wally couldn't speak. He had something to say, but couldn't get the words out. What could he say? She was hit by him. He had hurt her, but now she was on the other side of the bars, and she was in charge of his future. One of the agents walked up to the cell door and opened it. The loud click of the metal lock could be heard throughout the small room. Wally felt his heart race as he watched the door swing open. The two officers stood outside the door, waiting. Their faces were blank. Mary moved forward, but her eyes never left his. She carefully walked across the entrance of the cell and locked eyes with him. The intensity of her look made Wally's skin crawl. She didn't move or pause, even though she was right next to the man who had hit her. They stood there for a long time, locked in a silent fight of wills. In Wally's ears, he could feel his heart beating fast and wild against his ribs. As he tried to keep his face calm and show the confidence he used to wear like armor, it was wearing off. This thing felt like sand when he touched it. Mary finally spoke up. "You look like hell," she said. Wally blinked because what she said shocked him. He didn't expect that tone. She wasn't angry or yelling. She was just as cool and collected as she had been from the beginning. A dry throat made him swallow hard. His voice broke, and he had to clear it out before he could talk again. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Mary tilted her head a little and kept her eyes fixed on him. "No," she replied, her voice filled with apprehension. "You didn't mean to hit me. You didn't mean to lose control and assault a federal agent." Wally spoke, but the words didn't come out. He had no way to defend himself. He could not lie to her. She had seen everything, and had made him angry, but she didn't make him hit. That was all him. "I didn't know who you were," he said, in a low, almost begging voice. "I didn't know you were FBI. I thought you were just..." Mary cut through his reasons like a knife with her question. "Just what? Just an old woman you could push around? Someone you thought didn't matter?" Wally clenched his teeth. He turned his eyes away because he could no longer meet hers. Of course, she was right. Mary seemed like just another person who was in the wrong place at the wrong time to him. She had only upset him by questioning his power. He didn't care who she was. Mary asked, her voice sharp and full of anger. "Do you even know how many complaints have been filed against you? How many times you've crossed the line and gotten away with it?" Wally didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew for sure how many times people had complained about him. He had seen them, read the reports, and then seen them slip into the review process at the precinct. It didn't matter at all. He always knew that no one could hurt him, as long as the people in charge were on his side. Up until now. Mary took one more step toward him, and now her face was only a few inches away. Her voice was cold and hard as she asked, "You think you're special, don't you? You think you're different from all the other corrupt cops who get caught? That you're somehow above the law?" Wally could feel the rage rising in his chest. It was like an old friend coming to the surface. He had been told his whole career that he was unique and that the city needed tough, unwavering police officers like him who would do what no one else would. All of that felt empty when I stood in front of Mary Hill, though. "I was doing my job," he snapped, but his tone was harder than he meant it to be. "I was keeping the street safe. People like you? People like me," Mary said, her eyes getting dangerously narrow. "You mean people who hold you accountable? People who don't fall in line when you decide to play God with their lives?" Wally clenched his muscles and balled his hands into fists at his sides. He had never been so open and helpless before. Every word Mary said hurt, because it reminded him that he no longer had power or control. Mary asked, her voice rising a little, "You think this is just about you? You think you're the only one we're going after? You're part of a bigger problema system that's been rotting from the inside for years. You're just one piece of the puzzle." Wally's thoughts were going fast. He knew that more than one person was looking into it. But the way Mary was talking made it sound like they were planning something really big. He was going to be charged with more than just assaulting her. He was going to be a part of something much bigger that could ruin not only his job, but also the whole department. Wally asked, his voice shaking a little, "What do you want from me?" It was still there, just below the surface, but now there was fear mixed with the rage. Mary looked at him for a long time, but her face couldn't be read. She then stepped back and put her arms across her chest. She just said, "I want you to talk. I want you to tell me everything you know about Hanlon, about the other officers involved. I want names, dates, details." Wally felt sick to his stomach. Hanlon was his boss and mentor. He had always had his back, shielded him when complaints came in, and taught him how to get around in the complicated world of law enforcement. It would be like taking off his own arm to turn on Hanlon. "I can't," Wally said in a low voice, shaking his head. "I can't do that." Mary's eyes got red. "You don't have a choice, Steele. You're facing federal charges for assaulting an FBI agent. That's not going to go away with a slap on the wrist. You're looking at serious prison time. You're done." Wally's heart was racing because of how heavy her words were and how they hit him. It was over for him. His job was over. There was no way out of this. But he couldn't stand the thought of betraying Hanlon, the man who had been like a father to him. "If you help," Mary said, her voice a little softer, "we can figure something out. But if you don't say anything, you'll go down alone. And in federal prison, you'll realize how little loyalty means in the end." Wally's mind was full of feelings that didn't agree with each other. Because he had worked hard for years to build his job and reputation, it all fell apart in just a few hours. He could get help from Mary, but it would cost something, and he wasn't sure if he was willing to pay it. I need time, he said, in a voice that was almost a whisper. Mary's face stayed cold and unbending. You don't have much time, Steele. The walls are closing in. You can either help us take down the rest of the corruption in your department, or you can go down with them. The choice is yours. She then turned around and walked toward the cell door, leaving Wally alone in his cell in the dead quiet. The door slammed shut behind her, and he could still hear the sound long after she was gone. The news that Officer Wally Steele had been arrested spread very quickly. The news sites from all over the country, and even some in smaller towns, covered the story. The news was full of stories about the bad cop who attacked an undercover FBI agent. Journalists quickly dug into Steele's past, his many complaints of wrongdoing, and his link to a larger web of corruption in the police force. To change the story, the people was outraged right away. Protests broke out outside the police station, making the community even more tense than it was before. Because of years of problems between residents and police, there were a lot of angry, frustrated people there, with signs that said, "Justice for all," and "End police brutality." There was a growing sense that this was about more than just Wally Steele. It was about a system that had not held people like him accountable for far too long. While working in the portable FBI office, Mary Hills stood in front of a row of TVs and watched the news. Even though her face was healing from the blow, it hurt to remember the night she had challenged Steele. She was putting herself at risk by going underground, in a place that was so dangerous and racist, but it was worth it. The audio records, video footage, and statements from victims that they had gathered were very bad. The only thing that was really wrong was Steele. Once they had him, the other dishonest police officers would soon follow. She walked up to her boss, Harris, who crossed his arms and stared at the screens. He said in a low voice, "It's bigger than we thought. These protests are about more than Steele. They're about the entire department." Mary said, "Yes. They've been waiting for this. The community's been living under the thumb of officers like Steele for years. He's not the only one. This is a chance for them to finally be heard." Harris took a quick look at her and frowned a little. "You think it's going to get worse?" Mary didn't think twice. "Yes," she answered firmly. "Once we start pulling at this thread, it's going to unravel the whole department. And people are going to push back, both inside and outside the precinct." Harris let out a sigh, and his shoulders sagged a little from the weight of what was about to happen. He said, "We're ready for that," but his voice was tired. "But it's going to be a fight. We'll need Steele to flip. He's our best shot at bringing down the higher-ups." Mary kept her eyes on the screens the whole time. "He'll flip," she said, in a calm voice. "He knows what's coming, and he knows he can't face it alone. He'll talk." Mary knew it wouldn't be easy as she said the words. Steele was faithful to the system that had kept him safe for years, and to Hanlon, his boss, who had always kept him from having to deal with the results of his actions. It would take more than the fear of jail time to break that promise. He would have to face who he was and what he had become. As the news kept going, Mary's phone rang in her pocket. A text message from an agent at the office said, "Hanlon is watching you. Be careful." She took it out and read it. Mary's eyes got very dark. She was ready for this. Hanlon was very smart, almost sneaky. As a police officer for a long time, he knew how to hide his tracks. But now that Steele is in jail and the police are closing in on him, he would be scared. Men who were desperate made bad decisions. As chaos grew outside, Lieutenant Greg Hanlon stood in his office and stared at the closed blinds that separated him from it. The protest sounds started to come in, chants and shouts that were hard to hear, broken up by the honking of car horns and the faraway hum of helicopters flying overhead. He could feel the walls closing in on him and the pressure rising. He had been able to keep things under control for years. He ran the police department the way he saw fit, making sure that cops like Steele could do their jobs without any help from clerks or watchdogs. He stopped people from complaining, handled internal investigations with ease, and made sure that his officers' boy stayed on the streets to keep the city safe. But now, everything was going wrong. Steele had been careless and stupid. Hanlon had told Steele not to lose his cool and let his anger get the best of him, but Steele didn't listen. After that, he hit an FBI agent who was lying. He was shocked and couldn't believe it. Even though it had been days since the punch, it was still caught on camera. You couldn't hide it or make it look better. Steele had gone too far, and now the whole area was being looked at closely. Hanlon was thinking when his work phone rang. It woke him up. The caller ID showed that it was someone from City Hall that he knew. He thought about it for a second before picking up. "Hanan," he replied quickly. The other end of the call said, "Lieutenant, we have a problem." There was a lot of worry in it, more worry than Hanan had ever heard before. The mayor's office wants to do a full study of the precinct from the inside. They are bringing in civilian oversight panels and outside investigators. If you don't get this under control, we'll have to be redone from scratch. Hanan's grip on the phone got tighter, and his fingers turned white as he realized what was going on. Everything would be revealed in a full internal review, including the lies, the cheating, and the deals he made behind closed doors. As soon as people found out about that, it would be him, not just Steele, who went down. The precinct's whole command system would be ripped apart, leaving only scandal and shame behind. Hanan answered, "We're working on it." His voice was calm and cold, but his heart was racing. Steele has been around for a while. The rest of the department is being kept away from him because he's the face of this right now. He's going to be blamed. The person on the other end of the line said, "It's not going to be enough. This is bigger than Steele. They want blood in the riots and in the news. They are going to keep looking for responsibility until they find it. Get ahead of this, or they'll bury you." For a moment, Hanan was quiet. His mind was busy. He had been through tough times before, but this was different. The people wanted to know everything that had been going on in his area. And if they did, there would be no stopping the damage. Hanan finally said, "Let me handle Steele." His voice was low and scary. A scared person on the other end of the phone asked, "He won't talk." Hanan's eyes got darker. "Then we'll keep him from doing that." Mary was sitting at her desk in the FBI office, going over the file they had made on Steele and the other cops who were being investigated. People's complaints, reports of wrongdoing that were swept under the rug, and proof of a coordinated effort to keep officers like Steele from facing the results of their actions, took her hours to look through. It looked like a web, and Hanan was in the middle of it. Since she went underground, she had been keeping a close eye on Hanan. He was very careful, but he still missed some things. He was involved, and the signs were clear. A few talks that were recorded, and a pattern of ignoring complaints that named his favorite officers, including Steele. Mary knew that they could take down Hanan along with Steele if they could get him to turn. The phone rang again, and this time Harris was calling. He said, "Mary," in a tense voice, as soon as she picked up. "We need to fix this. Steele won't talk." Mary made a face, and her heart sank a little. "He's not willing to work with us." "Well, not really," Harris answered. "He's scared. Hanan has him under control. He knows that if he speaks, it's over. He will be taken out by Hanan." Janet's heart stopped beating. Hanan might try to protect himself, she thought, but in a direct threat to Steele's life? That was a dangerous turn of events. As she stood up, she said, "We need to get to Steele before Hanan does. Hanan might do something crazy if he's that desperate." "He's going to a secure federal prison tomorrow morning," Harris said. "But for now, he's still in city jail." She felt her heart beat faster. Hanan could still get to the city jail. It was something she had seen before. The most powerful police officers could make people disappear, even inside the walls of a station. Mary grabbed her jacket and said, "I'll go to the jail. He'll be safe until the transfer," I said. "I'll be there if Hanan tries something." Harris didn't say anything for a moment before he sighed. "Watch out, Hill, when Hanan is cornered. He's very scary." Mary quickly answered, "I know." Her voice was steady but tense. "That's why I need to do this." Later that night, Mary went to the city jail. You could feel the stress in the air. There was less noise in the area than normal because the protests outside the building had ended, leaving behind a tense calm. The mood inside was sad. Officers walked through the halls with their heads down. They knew that the public and the press were watching their whole department, and that one mistake could make things even worse. Mary went down to the area where Steele was being held until he could be moved in the morning. The guard looked wary at her as she walked up, but he didn't say anything. She was the secret spy who had caught one of their own, so everyone knew who she was. While in his cell, Steele leaned against the wall and stared blankly at the floor, as if he hadn't slept in days. His face was pale, and his eyes were red as blood. When Mary walked up to him, he looked up, but his face couldn't be read. She stepped up to the bars and said, "You're still here. I didn't think you'd make it through the night." Steele's jaw got tight, but he didn't say anything. Mary let out a sigh and leaned against the bars. "Wally, I know you're scared. You are in a bad spot because of Hanan, but now is your chance to do the right thing. There is still something you can take away from this, at least, your honor." When Steele looked up and met hers, Mary saw fear in his eyes for the first time instead of anger. Deep fear that hurts. He knew what was going to happen. Steele finally said, "I can't," but his voice was very low. "Hanan, you don't get it. I can't leave because of him. He'll kill me before I can speak." Marge leaned in closer, and her voice was soft but strong. "Wally, you're already in danger. Hanan will not back down from threats, but we can keep you safe if you help us. You won't have to worry about Hanan again for the rest of your life." Steele wasn't sure what to do. He ran his hands through his hair, which made his hands shake a little. Mary could see the fight going on in his mind, the fear of Hanan vs. the hope that he could get out of this nightmare one last time. "You don't understand," Steele said in a whisper, so quiet that you could hardly hear him. "The things I've done, and the things we've done. It's not just Hanan, it's all of us. Everyone is dirty." Mary felt her heart beating fast. This was it. The steel was beginning to break. "Then help me clean it up," she said in a deep, quiet voice. "Wally, you don't have to go down with them. You can leave this, but you need to help me." Mary thought she saw a flash of resolve in Steele's eyes as they locked on hers. But it was gone in an instant, and that same fear took its place. His voice was shaking as he shook his head. "I can't. I am not able to do it." Mary's stomach felt sick. She could see that his fear was holding him back. Steele was scared to get away from Hanan because he had his hooks deep in her. She stepped back from the bars and said, I'll be back in the morning for the transfer. Then you'll be safe." Steele's voice stopped her as she was about to leave. "Agent Hill?" Mary took a moment to look back over her shoulder. Steele said, "Thank you," but his voice was almost a whisper. "For giving me a chance." Mary gave a quick nod and then turned to leave. She could already feel her mind running with ideas for what to do next. The night wasn't over yet, and she knew Hanan wouldn't do nothing while Steele was being held. Late at night, the sky was still dark as Mary Hill drove through the empty streets on her way to the city jail. The early morning felt heavy. She had a tight grip on the driving wheel because of all the things that had happened in the last few days. Wally Steele had made a difference. He was arrested, which set off a chain of events that could be felt in the police department, the city, and even her own mind. Even though she knew Hanan was dangerous and would do anything to protect himself. What Steele said last night surprised her. "It's all of us. We're all dirty." Steele's words had been in her head the whole way home, even though she tried to block them out. It turned out that there was more corruption than she thought, with people other than Hanan and Steele being involved. Now, the whole precinct was in danger, which made everything even more risky. She was no longer just fighting one bad officer. She was fighting a whole system that had been badly broken for years. As she got closer to the city jail, the headlights of her car cut through the darkness. The building in front of her looked like a concrete castle. Mary felt a knot in her gut as she saw the single guard standing at the door. The thought that something was wrong wouldn't go away. Before she left, she checked in with Harris, and everything seemed fine on paper. Steele was still in jail, and the move was still set to happen in the morning. But the air was still heavy with fear, telling her otherwise. It was cold outside when Mary got out of her car and into the lot. She took a deep breath and then went outside. She could feel the cold in the air because the wind bit at her skin, seep into her bones. As she got closer to the front door, she looked up at the building and narrowed her eyes as she saw something strange. Not as many lights were on as usual. There was always a lot going on in the precinct, especially in the holding room. But tonight it felt different, too still and too quiet. She showed the guard at the door her FBI ID, and he nodded. He then moved aside to let her in. The uneasiness grew as she walked through the halls. The holding room, which is usually busy with officers coming and going, was almost empty. Nothing was said, no papers were shuffled, and no keys were hit. There was only quiet. The hall was filled with the sound of Mary's steps as she made her way to the cell block where Steele was being held. The block door was just a little open, and as she pushed it open, her heart skipped a beat. There was something very wrong. As she walked inside, her hand naturally moved to her sidearm, but she put it away for now. The cell block wasn't very well lit. A few dimming lights cast long, scary shadows on the floor. She looked down the row of cells. All but the last one, which was meant to be Steele's, were empty. Her heart beat faster as she got closer to the last cell. Steele's cell door was wide open. Mary quickly reached for her gun and took it out of its holster as she ran forward, fast. Her heart was beating fast. When she got to the cell, she stopped moving and her breath got caught in her throat. Steele was still and lying on the floor. It looked like time stopped for a second. As Mary stood there and stared at Steele's lifeless body, the air in the cell was heavy and stuffy. It was hard for her to understand what she was seeing. But then it hit her like a sledgehammer. Steele wasn't moving, and his chest wasn't going up and down. There was no sound or life to be seen. No, Mary dropped to her knees next to him and mumbled something that was hard to hear. She put her gun away and put 2 fingers on his neck to feel for a pulse. She could feel her fingers shaking as they touched his cold skin. She was shocked as she looked for any sign of life, any chance that he was still alive, but there was none. Steele was gone, dead. As Mary looked around, she felt her stomach twist into a terrible knot. There was no blood or other clear signs of a fight. Steele was just lying on the floor with his eyes half open and staring blankly. As she pulled away from his body, she swallowed hard and her hands shook. How? What had taken place? The last time she was here, she talked to him and tried to get him to turn on Hanan. His fear had been real, but he was still living. Mary was sickened to know for sure that this wasn't a mistake. Now that he was gone, it was a message. So many things were going through her mind at once that she couldn't keep track of them all. Hanan had to be in charge of this. Steele had been a loose end in Hanan's corrupt scheme and a threat to the whole thing. He didn't want Steele to talk because he didn't want to take a chance. Mary got up, but her legs were shaking. She took her phone out of her pocket and called Harris. When the second ring came in, he picked it up. His voice was dull, but aware. I asked Mary, "What's going on?" She said, "Steele's dead," but her voice was flat, because she was still trying to understand what had happened. The other end of the line went silent for a long time before Harris spoke again. His voice was tense with shock. "Dead? How?" "I don't know," Mary said, her voice tense with anger. "I found him. He's cold and doesn't look like he was hurt in any way." "But, Harris, this doesn't make sense." He was scared, but he was ready to turn around. He was going to tell us everything about Hanan. "He's dead now, and I think Hanan killed him first." That meant a lot, so there was another pause. This one was longer and tougher. "Do we know anything about Hanan? Is there something that connects him to this?" "What did Harris ask?" She said in a stern voice, "Not yet. But we need to get going quickly. Hanan is cleaning up after himself, and Steele wasn't the only one who helped. Others are in charge, and there are some dangling ends. We'll lose all of them if we don't do something soon." When Harris spoke again, his voice was calm but strong. "Okay, all the team. We're not going to let this go," Mary said. She hung up the phone and put it back in her pocket, her hand shaking a little. She took one last look at Steele's body. Her chest was red with anger and frustration. Steele had been crooked, but he was also the way she got in. He was the one who brought down Hanlon and showed what was wrong with the department. Now that he was gone, it was harder to see how to move forward. She walked out of the cell, her mind already planning her next move, away from the body. Hanlon messed up. Even though he shut Steele up, he showed how desperate he was in the process. As guys who were desperate did bad things, Mary was going to make Hanlon pay for all of them. As she left the holding room, she saw the first few police officers come in for the early shift. Their faces were tense, and as she walked by, their eyes darted toward her uncomfortably. Steele's death wouldn't be a secret for much longer. The stories were already going around. Mary was aware that she needed to move quickly. Now that the investigation was in the hands of the federal government, the news media would soon be all over the story. She had to make sure they had enough proof to catch Hanlon before he could hide his tracks again. Again, her phone rang, and she looked down to see a text message from someone on her team. "It looks like they are getting Hanlon's phone records. It seems like he had a lot of calls last night." Mary's heart beat faster. It gave her a starting point, something she could use to link Hanlon to Steele's death. She knew it wasn't enough by itself, but it was a thread she could pull on. As she did, the whole thing would come apart. When Mary got back to the FBI building, the team was already working hard. Harris was in charge of making sure that the proof was kept safe so that it wouldn't get lost. They were going through phone records, video footage, and anything else they could find that might link Hanlon to Steele's death. "Mary," Harris yelled as she walked into the room. "We have something." There were several calls Hanlon made last night. One of them was to a fake phone that we found to belong to a known enforcer. Janet had a rush of energy. "An officer? Like a killer?" Harris gave a grim nod. "That way it looks. We're still trying to find him, but this is a start. We have Hanlon. If we can connect this person to Steele's death." Mary's thoughts were already focused on what she should do next. They had to move quickly. Hanlon was smart, and he would have backup plans ready. But he made a big mistake. He didn't realize how far she and her team were willing to go. Mary said, with a firm voice, "Let's get him before he has a chance to disappear." When the team got to work, Mary could feel Steele's death pushing down on her, but that only made her more determined. Hanlon thought he had won because he had stopped the probe by making Steele quiet. She wasn't going to let him off the hook, though. Even though she lost Steele, she wasn't going to lose this fight. Even before the sun came up, the wheels were already moving. The enforcer who was tied to Hanlon's burner phone had been found by Mary's team, and a warrant was being made to question him. Every move Hanlon made was being watched by people who were ready to attack when the time was right. In the FBI office, Mary stood in front of the big window and looked out at the city as the sun came up for the first time. As dawn broke, the city's streets came to life. It had been a long, tense night, but she couldn't rest yet. The death of Steele was a setback that showed how far guys like Hanlon were willing to go to protect themselves. But it had also made her more determined. The department had a lot of corruption, but she was going to get rid of it one piece at a time. Hanlon was next on her list. Mary Hill stood in front of the station. The cold early morning air made her breath stand out. The air was cool and crisp, making me feel excited. It was just getting light, and the sun was making the city slowly come to life with a pale golden glow. Mary had a clear, sharp mind as she got ready for what was going to happen. They were going to kill Lieutenant Greg Hanlon today. Everything went into speed after Steele's death. Hanlon played his hand too much, and the FBI now had enough proof to step in. They found a hired enforcer through the calls he made to the burner phone. This man had a past of getting problems solved for people who could pay. The man was picked up overnight and turned himself in almost right away, which proved what Mary had already thought. Hanlon had ordered Steele's murder to keep him from talking. When the FBI put pressure on the officer, he didn't even think twice about telling them the truth. Hanlon made the mistake that killed him, and now, it was time to get even with him. She waited outside the door to the precinct for the rest of the team to show up. The FBI agents she had been working with for a few months were getting together to get ready for the raid. Officers on the day shift were starting to come into the building, but they had no idea what was going to happen. After months of hard work, this was the big day. Mary knew that everything depended on today going as planned. Harris walked up to her and looked serious, but determined. "You ready for this?" Mary said, "Yes, it's time." The team had been planning the whole action for the past few hours. In order to catch Hanlon for good, they were ready to search his office, take his personal files, and arrest him. It wasn't just about killing Steele anymore. It was about taking down the whole corrupt system Hanlon had set up in the station. These days, they would bring it all down. As soon as the last FBI agent showed up, Harris gave the order to move in. It was Mary and Harris who led the way. They walked through the station doors with their badges clearly visible. The front desk officers barely had time to figure out what was going on before the agents spread out to secure the area and make their way to Hanlon's office. The mood in the station changed right away. Talk spread like wildfire, and the officer's face showed a range of emotions, from shock to fear. Everyone knew that something important was going on. His office was at the end of a long hallway. The blinds were drawn and the door was closed. As they got closer, Mary's heart was racing. Her mind was heavy with the events going on around her. That was it. They had worked months to get to this point. Harris knocked on the door, and his voice was strong. "I told Lieutenant Hanlon, FBI. Open the door." A long, tense pause followed. Mary kept her hand on her sidearm, ready for anything. She looked at Harris and thought about all the things that could happen. Had Hanlon run away? Was he carrying a gun? The door slowly opened, and Hanlon walked through it. He looked calm, but there was a flicker of something dark in his eyes that could have been rebellion or resignation. A group of agents stood behind Mary and Harris, and he looked at them first. "What's this about?" Hanlon asked with a controlled tone of voice. "You know what this is all about," Mary said, as she moved forward. "You're under arrest for the murder of Wally Steele, and for your role in obstructing justice and orchestrating corruption within this department." Hanlon didn't move for a short time. As he stood there, his eyes kept going back and forth between Mary and Harris. Then, slowly, he moved out of the way so the agents could come into his office. Mary could tell he was tense by the way he stood, and how his hands were clenched at his sides, but he didn't fight back yet. He took a step forward and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Turn around, Lieutenant." Hanlon's jaw clenched, but he did what he was told and turned around with his hands behind his back. Harris used a practiced move to snap the cuffs into place, and the sound echoed through the small office. Mary carefully watched, ready for Hanlon to speak and break out. But he didn't say a word as Harris led Hanlon out of the office. Mary stayed behind and looked around the room. This was where all the corruption was happening. Hanlon had planned it all, and this is where he hid complaints, changed records, and looked out for officers like Steele. The years of lying, cheating, and abusing power were heavy on her mind. She carefully went through his desk, opening drawers, and looking through files to look for anything that could help them make their case. Harris stole Hanlon's laptop, and the tech team would look through it for any digital proof. But Mary was looking for something more real, something that would help her understand Hanlon's mind and how bad the corruption really was. As she dug through a stack of papers, she touched a small notebook, bound in leather, that was hidden at the back of the box. She took it out and opened it up, which made her eyes widen. There were dozens of names inside, of police officials, informants, and regular people. There were numbers and figures next to some of them. That looked like money, bribes, or favors. It was kind of like a ledger, with black and white records of years of crime. Mary felt her heart race as she turned the leaves. The size of what she was holding made her mind spin. Not only was this proof that Hanlon was involved, but it also showed the whole operation, every cop who had been in Hanlon's network, every illegal deal, and every cover-up. It was all here. It was closed with a snap, and she put it in her jacket. This was the smoke gun they were looking for, the last piece of the puzzle. This would let them take down the whole crooked system, from top to bottom. A crowd had formed outside the precinct, and news cameras were flashing as reporters rushed to get pictures. People knew that Lieutenant Greg Hanlon, who was well liked by his co-workers, had been taken by the FBI. Protests that had been building for days were now hitting a fever pitch, with new information about corruption in the department adding fuel to the fire. The crowd went wild as Hanlon was taken out in handcuffs. Some people screamed in anger, while others cheered, their voices full of shock and relief. The community had felt helpless for a long time, because of a system that looked out for itself instead of the people it was meant to serve. Now, they were seeing one of the most important men in that system fall. Hanlon stood there with his eyes closed while the cameras flashed. He wouldn't look at the crowd or admit that what was happening was real. She could tell he was scared by the look in his eyes and the way his shoulders tensed up as the police led him to the waiting car. He knew this was the end. She stood on the steps of the station and watched the scene as Hanlon's car door slammed shut and he was driven away. Harris joined her, and his face showed a mix of tiredness and happiness. "We did it," he said, in a low voice. Mary agreed, but the wind made her feel bad. Hanlon was down, but the fight wasn't over yet. There were still more people in the department who were involved. These were officers who had let the cheating happen and not done anything about the power abuses. The case would go on, and the FBI would find and catch all of them. They had won the fight for now, though. While chanting, the people outside kept raising their voices at the same time. Justice. Accountability. No more bribery. The electricity was a real warning. That this wasn't just about Steele or Hanlon, but about a system that was broken and needed to be fixed from the ground up. As the day went on, Mary thought about the path that had brought her to this point. She had hidden herself and risked everything to tell the truth. She had dealt with guys like Steele and Hanlon, who thought they couldn't be hurt. And now that she was on the other side, she knew how important it had been. But Steele's death was the one thing that kept coming back to her. Yes, he was a part of Hanlon's system, but he was also a man stuck in the system he had helped keep going. He was ready to turn around and help take out Hanlon, but he was stopped before he could. Mary couldn't get rid of the thought that Steele's death had been a turning point, even though it had cost a lot. "Do you think we'll ever clean it all up?" she asked, in a quiet voice, as she looked out at the crowd. Harris was quiet for a second before he spoke. "We'll get as much of it as we can, but this kind of corruption grows like a weed. When you pull one up, another one goes in its place." Mary agreed, since she knew he was right. However, they were still going to fight. Now that the system was out in the open, they could rebuild it and make it better and more fair. Change was possible, but it would take time. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Mary felt like the end of something was coming. The story wasn't over, But this part was. There were still fights to be had and people who needed justice. But they had won for now, and that was enough. Mary was by herself in her apartment that night. The lights were dim, and she looked out the window at the city below. Even though everything that had happened was heavy on her, she felt at peace for the first time in a long time. She looked down at the phone on the table when it rang. It was a text message from Harris. "We made a difference today. Take a break." Mary put down the phone and leaned back in her chair with a small smile. They had fought long and hard, but they had won. They caught a man who thought he couldn't be caught, and fixed a system that had been broken for too long. The work would continue tomorrow. She let herself rest tonight, though, because she knew the fight for justice wasn't over yet, and she was ready for whatever came next.